All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another Tuesday Tech Talk. Today we have Enrico with us, our local retrospective master, and he's going to talk to us about measuring success in Agile Retrospectives, something we do every week here at Pivotal. So without further ado, take it away, Enrico.
Hey, welcome everyone. And thanks for taking time to listen to this chat. I wouldn't call myself a master at all. I started doing retros about 4 years ago. I was actually at a former Pivotal client, and I always try and change up the format, look more into like what's the objective and purpose of retrospectives. In this presentation, you'll learn a little bit about what retrospectives are, and as well as how to measure their success. And I have like a couple of questions to help me like gauge where to put emphasis in this talk. So by a raise of hand, how many of you has done retrospectives before joining Pivotal Labs? Up all the way, please. Cool, awesome. How many of you have read this book by Derby and Larson? And when I say read, I mean like back to back. Awesome. How many of you have read this book by Kurth? Okay. So those two are basically the equivalent of the Gang of Four books for engineers, but for retrospectives. Project Retrospective came out in the early 2000s. The other one about later on a little bit. There's a new book that came out this year called Improving Agile Retrospectives. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about are ideas coming out of that. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a background about retrospectives. When I lived in Colorado, I joined this search and rescue class. And search and rescue teams, after they run the deployments, they do this thing called debriefings. And during the class that I was at, so I never made it through the search and rescue, by the way, so never done any of that crazy stuff. I was only there for a couple of times, and during the classes, they do a debriefing of the incidents that they were deployed for the weekend or for the week before. And imagine that you are in a search and rescue team, and you get a call that someone is lost, and so you get deployed. And the weather changes, and it starts raining, but your team didn't pack any waterproof gear. So you start getting wet. And then you try and contact the other teams that are deployed to see where they're at, and the radio doesn't work. And then about an hour later, you meet the other team and you find out that they found the body of the person. Now this is loosely based on one of those debriefings. The team was looking back at what could they have done differently. So those debriefings are similar to the retrospective concept. We look back in hindsight, what could we have done differently? And they do it in that scenario where there's like a much higher stake involved. So retrospective is a time to reflect. It's a time where the team and the facilitator, represented by a koala icon, work together. So the facilitator doesn't have an agenda. The facilitator's job is to help the team reflect. And who is it for? Retrospective is for the team. It shouldn't be for you to talk about something you care, or for you and another person to have a discussion. And that's not what retrospective is about. Retrospective should always be focused for the team. Of course, retrospective has to be safe, so we will look during this presentation briefly on how to make sure that your retro is safe. And most importantly, even when the retrospective is safe, you want to make sure that you measure its success. And we will look at a couple of ways to do that. So in the Agile Manifesto, there is a part that says that the team reflects at regular intervals. So that's what retrospective is. We do it at regular intervals. How many of you go to the doctor for a yearly checkup? Raise your hand. Okay, that's not too bad, half and half. But if you don't, you might end up like me, with one of my old fillings popping up as I was eating popcorn and having to do an emergency root canal. So you do not want your team to have an emergency root canal. You want to run your retrospectives every week at regular intervals. I once spoke with someone, yeah, we run retrospectives when we need it. When you need it, it's going to be too late. So regular intervals, like what we do at Pivotal, every week, is one of the 2 meetings that we enforce. And we want to reflect. So it's a time to think back, not just like to act. And we will look a little bit about that. Does any of you know the double loop learning and single loop learning difference? So this is something I learned about a month ago, and it's pretty interesting. So the single loop learning, there's an article, and I'll share the slides later on. In the single loop learning, what you do is basically look at there's a problem, how do we fix it? So there is something wrong, and it's not what we like, and so we're trying how do we make it better. The biggest problem with this is that we're not really we're only reacting to it. We're not solving the symptoms. The root causes are still there. So the same problem will probably come back. So there's a thing I call retrospective whack-a-mole. When we look at each item at a time, so we bring our topic to the table, and everyone had a lot of topics, so here are all our topics, and when we whack them one at a time with action item, action item, action item, well, we got 6 models whacked. Is that good? So we fixed something, probably, sometimes, not all the times. But we have not really looked at the root cause of those problems, so they might come back. Retrospective is not a time to just like whack moles. It's good that we do. It's good that we talk about those moles. It's good that the moles come out of the ground. We don't want them in the ground. And because it's a safe environment, we're allowed to have those moles out. But it's good to reflect. Look at those moles. Look what's behind it. Look for patterns. Maybe you got something behind them. So then the double loop learning, what you're trying to do is to correct or change the underlying causes. So you don't just action, result, and change that loop. You go back and you question your assumptions. This leads to organizational learning, and that's what the bigger objective of retrospectives is. It reflects. So it's not a blame game. Luckily at Pivotal, it's always been, I've been at Pivotal 3 years, and 95% of the retros I've been in, it's always been safe. I think Pivots and our clients, we create an environment where people feel like safe to speak up. But that's not always the case. I remember working in a company in Italy where one of the managers was like, fuori nomi. Fuori nomi. Give us the names. Whose fault is it? We need names. Retrospective is a time where there shouldn't be a blame game. And we will briefly see, how do we make our retrospective safe? How many of you know Kurt Prime Directive? Raise your hand. Kurt is one of the guys that wrote one of the books that I show you, the inventor of Agile retrospectives, as the term is, we know it. And Kurt Directive states that regardless of what we discover today, we truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. And last time I gave this presentation in Sydney, someone shouted at me, "That's a lie! You're lying! Don't say that!" And so I wrote a blog post about analyzing Kurt's Prime Directive. During a retrospective, what I like to do is to ask the team a verbal yes. Do you agree this? It's important to get a verbal yes, and it's important to understand what's behind it, regardless of what we discovered today. Of course, today we will learn more than we knew in the previous iteration. But we want to truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time. What did that person know? What are their skills and abilities? What was the situation at hand? All those givens are the reason you accept the Prime Directive. You want to look at all those factors and then reflect. So Kurt's Prime Directive is a good way to set a safe stage. Focus on is another one where we want to make sure that we focus on understanding. We focus on dialogue instead of debate. Make sure that all those things are clear. And so it's important to make sure that the retrospective is safe. Unsafe retro will not be successful. So once your retro is safe, how do we measure its success? The way I broke this up is with the 5 steps coming from the Agile retrospective book. And usually you measure in, well, usually you break it up. This is broken up into an hour. And again, this hour thing is pretty interesting. It came up recently on Twitter that someone said, oh, our retro is so rushed. I said, okay, how long does it take? 30 minutes. Okay, then maybe give it more time. Yeah, but the tool we use only has 30 minutes options. And so the writer of the Agile retrospective book replied, well, that's not the way to hold retrospectives. Luckily, we have little time timers in the office, so if it's too rushed, take more time. It doesn't have to be an hour. Does it have to be an hour for a team of 5 or a team of 15? How does that work? So just be aware that the length of the retrospective is really up to your team, your need, the topic that you're tackling. But in these 5 steps, we want to measure at the beginning, and we want to measure at the end. It's important to opening and close the retrospective. We will see those steps briefly, and we will dig into the measurements that we do. But the set the stage is when we make sure everyone understands what we're doing in retro. What's the purpose? What are we going to do for the next hour? And then we gather data, we get informations, similar to what we do with MedSat Glad. And then we generate insight. We look for patterns, we look for root causes, decide what to do, come up with a plan. Again, that should be measurable. And when we close, we want to measure the feedback of our retro. So the biggest takeout from today's talk should be that after you run your retro, you need to ask your team what was good, what was not good, and do it every week. Again, a regular interval. Don't just do it once every now and then. So when we open the stage, I like to do, it's called EsVP, which stands for Explorer, Shopper, Vacationer, or Prisoner. This is an anonymous activity that collects data from your team. You ask them to put on a piece of paper which role represents them in today's retrospective. Do they feel like an explorer, someone that wants to make the most out of retro, leave no stone unturned, very engaged? A shopper, someone that is interested in retro, happy to be here, happy to go home with one piece of information? Or are you a vacationer? Not really interested in retro, but happy to have drinks, happy to kind of like not be doing work at the desk. Or a prisoner. You've been forced to be in retro, you don't see the point of retro. And so the way you do it is just put on opposite notes, fold it, do a count. Like that was like one of the team in Sydney. And then you keep track of it. So every week you print out and you see, well, how many prisoners we have, how many vacationers we have. And if something changes, it's important to know. If there's a shift, now you know because you're tracking it. And then you gather data. So gather data, there's multiple ways to do it. You can do it in Trello if you're online. You can do it on a physical board, which is my personal preference, because when you collect data like this, you can do a couple of things. One, you can tackle items that can be actioned immediately. Sometimes we put things off just for retro to be discussed. For example, on this team I was, there was this problem in Gradle, dependencies not being fetched, and we use the timeline and we put it on the timeline and we go, yeah, my pair goes, yeah, we're going to discuss that at retro. Well, do we need to wait until retro? Is there something that we can do about it right now? And there was. We created a chore to investigate that thing. So instead of spending 5 minutes at retro saying how Gradle sucks and this problem, blah, 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 let's do something. But let's remember that event and use it during retro. The other thing you can do when you have those post-its is run a month-long or a longer-term retrospective, because the heartbeat one that we run is focused on the team. But when you look at the whole month or the longer period of time, you can look at patterns that affect not just the team, but also different divisions of the same company or people outside of the team. So once you looked at the data, now you can start thinking, okay, what do I do about it? And generating insights is that time. There are multiple activities. One is where you look for patterns in your timeline. Another one, you ask yourself, what if the next iteration will be perfect? What will be different? What would the team will different so that the next iteration is perfect? And you gather, again, you try and find pattern names, and then you're going to move on. But Team Radar is another one where you rate between 0 and 10. How well are we doing on this topic? What would be different if there was a 10 instead of a 0? And then you decide what to do. Once you generated that insight, once you found out what you want to focus on, and during that phase, you also prioritize. That's what those dots are. We can't focus on everything, especially if we have an hour and a half. And so you prioritize on something, and then you decide what to do with some experiment or action item or whatever we want to call it. Something that is actionable, something that we're going to follow up. And I like to use the SMART acronym as a way to make something specific. Something that is somewhat measurable, so that we can tell when are we done, what is the outcome of this. Something that is relatable and time-bound. So we're going to try, let's say we're trying something new. Let's try for a week. Let's try for 2 weeks. Let's commit to this time frame. Let's not say that we're going to do it forever. So this is another thing that should be measurable. You should print it out and keep track of the progress of those things. And now it's about time to close out. You should have about 5-10 minutes to finish off your retro. And you want to make sure that you have a time to finish the retro. And what I like to do here is to get a return of time invested. So you ask your team between 0 and 4, how well spent was the time during this meeting? Where 0 is a complete waste of time. 1 was mostly a waste of time. I learned something, but very little. 2 was about equal. It was a good meeting. 3 was I learned more than the time I invested in this meeting. And 4 means I learned a lot. If I missed this meeting, it would have been a problem. I would have missed out on some key information. So you ask your team to put a dot, and you ask them one suggestion or the one idea that would have their point go up 1. So if they're a 3, what would make it a 4? If it's a 2, what would make it a 3? And so on. You write down that idea. This is not the time to discuss or start arguing about those ideas. You just write them down, and you are going to reflect about those and adapt the next retrospective. And again, you make sure that you track those and you put on near your whiteboard so that you know how the team feels. You can also run it anonymously on a little sticky note with the idea. Ultimately, during the closeout, it's also good to do an activity called appreciation. Try and hand on a high note on things that went really well during the iteration. So you say, I appreciate Jack for doing this and this and this. Ultimately, make sure that you keep trying new things with your retrospective and you measure things in your retrospective. There are infinite number of universes out there. And some of them, our retrospectives suck, and some of them are not safe. Hopefully in this one, we learned a few more tricks. We learned that it's important to find out how the team feels at the beginning. Let's gather that information, and let's keep track of it. As well as at the end, let's make sure that we get a return of time invested information from our team members. Let's make sure that we adapt that. Let's make sure that we come up with objectives that are meaningful to the whole team and not just to individuals. Thank you for listening. I'll be here taking questions. Thank you. Questions? Yep.
I think that a lot of the actions that you take in your retros are sort of retro on the retro itself, right? At what point, or do you find that there's a tipping point where it's like we're no longer talking about elastic management, we're no longer talking about the project, we're talking more about retros than we are about the project. How do you balance being able to effectively have the conversation about the project as opposed to about the conversation itself?
So the question is, it seems like the actions that we take are about retro versus the project. Yeah, I think I might have not given the right idea. When we talk about those topics, that's about the project itself. When we generate insights, we find, for example, there's some maybe problem in communication. In this specific radar, we were looking at the 12 Agile principles that this team was invested in learning at Pivotal. So we focus, during the retro, we focus on team-centric topics, but we try not to focus too much on single, this thing is broken. At the end, when we do this return of time, that is focused on the retro. So this is kind of like a little bit of feedback on that. But we shouldn't, so the retro itself is still about the team, and it's still about the team and the project. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any other question? Yep.
In recent times, I imagine that the team teams that you've been on started, or people came to that team following a different process for retro, and then you introduced us to the team. How have you found the team's reception to these?
Yes. So the question is, teams have probably been on different type of retros between this. What's the reaction to it? So what I've done, different. So some people are excited, some people are not. I think it's easy to gather that with the return of time invested. Without that, I think it'll be harder. So I think that's that one thing to be said. One thing that I've done in one of the teams when I was in Sydney was just introducing the EsVP and return of time invested in the middle of the retro they used to do. So what happened then, and the return of time invested, people started saying, well, it feels like we're always tackling those little things. Maybe we should tackle bigger topics. So that came out of the return of time invested. Someone started saying, well, some of those things that we have in our board for retro, shouldn't we tackle that when we see the red post-it note? Shouldn't we tackle that during the week? That actually was very exciting. So that is one approach, where you kind of like mellow introduction. Also, decide what to do when we did the action items. I was okay, let's make it smart. Let's make it measurable. Let's make it time-bound. By when are we going to do it? All that stuff. So that is a mellow introduction. And then there's the other introduction where you just do it. And sometimes teams are happy and sometimes they're less. But I think it's a good question. I think it's the mellow introduction should really be low, kind of like key entry, because 5 minutes to set the stage, 5 minutes to do the closeout. And now you have 2 data points that are pretty important and you can iterate over it. Does that answer? Cool. Yeah.
How do you approach a situation where the team wants to talk about stuff and change stuff that is outside of their control?
Great question. So how do you tackle things that are outside of the team control? So there's an activity called circles and soups. I don't have it up here. I should have put it. So in circles and soups, what you do is you have 3 circles. The inner circle is something that the team controls. You can take direct action. In the outer circle, it's outside of team control, but you can influence someone. And then there is the other circle, which is the soup, which is like the company and policies and things that you can only react to. So in that space, you can come up with plans to react to those. And then, if the organization is healthy, those topics should be exchanged with that division, or bringing a stakeholder that knows how to help us or knows about that. And then we have that person in our retro. And then we don't just like complain, this is shit, blah, 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 blah. We come up with a retro, we come up with a plan, we generate insights with that person in the room so that we share what's happening. And hopefully we come up with a plan with that person so that we can influence across the organization, across the team. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, another.
I think it's pretty typical on teams here to do retro toward the end of the week, maybe the last hour of the day on Friday. When I imagine that if folks are like me, I just need a vacation. Like I'm going to be a vacationer in that retro because it's the end of the day on Friday. Have you found that it's more effective to do retro at a different time of the week if you want to follow this?
Yeah, so the question is like, running retro at the end of the week, it feels like a bit of a vacation, a bit of a relaxing to decompress. I've noticed that too. When I joined in Colorado, I was asking one of the long-running developers there, and he was in one of the workshop with Kurt years ago, and he said, yeah, that format, this format of 5-step, that feels like work. The retro we do is more like, it's more relaxed, it's more chilled. It yields results, but at the same time we need to kind of balance it out. And I agree that having it doesn't have to be on Friday. I think it's, in Sydney, me and the team, we made pizza and we went out for drinks. So it's good to spend valuable time with your teammates, but that is not what Retrospective is about. Retro shouldn't be a time where we just like have fun. It can be. I think we should have fun with the team if we want, but having it and thinking of it as being that definitely doesn't allow us to get to these potential things that we could do. So yeah, it doesn't help. Maybe it's important to set the expectations as well. What do we want to get out of retro? And with the return on time invested, I think is a good beginning. You're gonna learn if people feel that way, and you can start measuring it. But does that answer the question?
Have you ever been more explicit about doing both of those things? So keeping a slice of time on the team to relax together and separately having retro more focused on getting things done?
I haven't. So when we were in Sydney, we were just like running retro. People will still have like, some people have drinks, some people have snacks. I think it's important to have snacks. Drinks, I was talking with my mentor about this retrospective stuff, someone that has more experience than me, because I felt like I need to have someone to bounce off ideas. And when I told her like that, what do you think about drinking during retros? And she laughed. And she was like, I think that can be a big problem. I think with our teams, it's probably not a problem, but there's like both sides. I think if I have a drink at retro, I'm not going to be effective. I'm not going to be focused. I know what's going to happen, how it's going to affect, alcohol is going to affect me. I think it's good to just like decide that retro, you can have drinks if that's what you want to do. You shouldn't be like saying you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't have that. But it's important to, when you set the stage, say like, what are we going to do during this hour? What are we trying to tackle? And make sure that the team, what are we going to learn? Make sure that the team is okay, like learning and doing that. So setting the expectation, I think, is important. Does that answer? Cool. Yeah.
Have you ever been on a team where everything's going really well every week, and then like because it comes on like live, you keep having retro, and every week you're just like everything's great?
Yes.
And if that is the case, how does it change your approach to how you run retro? And generally, am I struggling or am I like?
Yeah, so the question is, what if the team is just doing super well and it feels like, why are we running retro? Everything is doing super well. And we did. So this team in Sydney, actually, we were able to tackle a lot of the things, the problems that were coming up by ourselves. And it's interesting, when we looked at the timeline, we could see that a lot of the rare challenging events, we were able to fix them ourselves. It was a very healthy team. And they were asking a similar question, so it seems like this is going well. And so I said, okay, what else can we tackle? They were kind of like a satellite team within labs, and I said, maybe what we should start learning is like, how can we make this work for other teams back at your company? So try and come up with an experiment to make that. So I think the continuous learning, continuous like challenging things that maybe are outside your control are a good objective to have, even when everything seems to be going well. Yeah, that's cool. Any other question? Yeah.
So you have a retro that involves multiple teams, and it's a little bit more of a public forum. How do you encourage people to bring like handed items to the retro and not just keep everything kind of superficial?
Yeah. So the question is like, what if you have like a larger retro with multiple teams? How do you bring up like honest feedback items to the group? It depends on the group size as well. So how many people would that be?
Dozens, maybe?
Did you say dozens? Okay. So I think when you have like larger teams, you cannot expect to have like someone talking. You cannot have like the same group talking to each other. So you should do more muted activities where you basically write things on paper, and then as a group you try and group things and prioritize. That's a big departure from I want to tackle these items individually. But in general, when you have larger groups and when you have like different like teams in the room, it's also important to understand what is the objective of this. What are we trying to do in this retro? But I think in general, just do muted activity, put things on the table, and try and find what the root causes of some of those, or what the patterns of some of those problems are. That might help. Does that answer the question?
Interesting idea.
Yeah. There was another question at the back. Yeah.
Whose responsibility is it to follow up on the stickies from the ROI? Like the whole team. And I guess as a corollary to that, if you find that the ROI is not going up, you have to leave. What do you do?
Yeah. So the question is, who's in charge of following up from the return of time investor stickies, and also like what do you do if they don't go up, if they don't change? So the follow-up should be the facilitator or the product owner, someone that, or whoever really like feels like organizing the next retro will, in general, like the facilitator sends out an email with, this is the return of time invested, these are the suggestions, and then whoever does the next retro will account those ideas into it. As into like, if it's not going up, then obviously something is not working out. What I would do is send out an anonymous form with what are ideas that you would suggest. I would do anonymously because if it's not going up, it might not be very candid, like the conversation between the team, the facilitator. So just a form saying, hey, what have we tried that is not working? What should we try next? Kind of challenge those things. So that might help with that. Does that answer the question? Cool. Any other question? Yeah. So that's the question is, how do you feel about remote retros? I think that's a complete separate topic, and you can still utilize those 5 steps. Recently, I started experimenting with, I think it's called, what is that board that we use at Pivotal thing? Yeah, real-time board. That seems like a very adequate tool, because I've used other tools like Retrium and what's the one that we made? Postfactor. Yeah, Postfactor. They feel very limited. They put you kind of like in this shoebox. The Retrium one is a little bit more dynamic, but it's basically a facilitator that does stuff. That's what you don't want. You don't want a person to drive it out entirely. It's like a team collaboration thing. And what I like about that whiteboard thing is that you can get people to move things, and you can vote. So I think that is a very bright kind of like idea. I haven't been on a remote team recently, but I want to try those out. Definitely what I would suggest is video connection, obviously. So you must have like everyone on video so you can see each other. And if you have like only 1 or 2 elements that are remote, make sure that they are on an iPad or on a video channel so that they're not just listening. And keep them engaged. I've been on some remote retros where people just like obviously doing something else. Obviously. And they were just like, when called out, they were just like reporting on the status of this thing and then moving on. And that's what we try not to have. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Any other question? All right, so I'm going to send out some of those links and the slides. Thanks for participating.